Lecture 18. Does it seem warm to you? The little Optimum.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we explored the first in a cluster of 3 lectures that look back at turning points that were rather stretched over time. Our lecture today and the ones that came before it and which follow it focus generally on the period of about the year 1000 to 1300, when dramatic changes were taking place in the medieval world. Instead of trying to talk about everything that was happening in this period all at once, we're going to unpack this period gradually in a series of lectures that prove how interconnected so many of the discrete turning points we discuss in this course really are. Last time, we talked about the rise of a persecuting society and how, in the 11th through 13th centuries, the combination of religious zeal and negative feeling toward groups outside the mainstream of Christian society produced unpleasant consequences. Nowhere were those consequences more strongly felt than among the many Jewish communities spread throughout Europe. The rise of a persecuting society transformed not only the lives of Jews in the medieval world, but also transformed the society as a whole, giving it an indelible stamp of official intolerance that would persist into the early modern period with the Inquisition and into the modern day as well with the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. As opposed to the man-made fear and hatred we saw in our last lecture, today's discussion explores how completely natural phenomena radically reshaped European society from about 1000 to 1300. Specifically, I'm speaking of a blip in the world climate, in which over a period of some 400 years, things got warmer, on average, by a couple of degrees. Now, this might not sound like enough to make a difference, but in the grand scheme of things, as we're learning today, a change of just a degree or two can precipitate other changes that dramatically impact society, and which can then create a cascade effect, with other changes following quickly behind. Although technically it probably began in the mid-10th century and ended sometime in the 14th, this period we're focusing on, called by climatologists and archaeologists the Little Optimum, or medieval warm period, this period had its most strongly felt effects in the 11th and 12th centuries, the exact same time that the greatest persecutions of Jews, lepers, heretics, pagans, and other marginal groups was really gaining steam. From the vantage point of the long view of history, it would seem that these two things were most likely interconnected, but not in any ways that might be immediately obvious to the casual observer. In today's lecture, we'll see how one event precipitates another, and so on. So let's start with the year 1000 and step back and take a good look at the medieval world. What did it look like? Well, for one thing, it was a mostly rural agrarian society. 90 to 95% of the people living in the medieval world at the turn of the first millennium were dependent in some way on subsistence farming. And what this meant was that the margin between bounty and starvation was painfully razor thin. If one year a frost came late, or the rains were unexpectedly heavy, or the summer was too cool or too hot, then the crops failed and people didn't eat. Archaeologists examining skeletons from this period see clear evidence of malnutrition by today's standards, and evidence also of back-breaking labor. There was trade, of course, but there were no large urban centers as there had been during the Roman Empire. There was a cash economy, but most transactions were conducted through the barter system. The population of Europe was somewhere around 35 million people or so, and most people lived in small hamlets surrounded by agricultural fields, on the margins of which were thousands and thousands of acres of forest. It was said that you could travel from France to Poland during this time and never see daylight, so heavily wooded was such a large portion of the countryside. 300 years later, the population would have reached around 80 million. Cities like London, Paris, and Rome were booming in terms of trade, and the forests had diminished significantly. A large portion of the population also was making a living at various trades, many of which had nothing to do with subsistence farming. The medieval world was now filled with soaring cathedrals, and there were even people who could make a living at being poets. Poets, I tell you! How did medieval civilization come to this point? What made this flourishing of the arts possible? Well, many scholars hold that this dramatic transformation had nothing at all to do with men, ultimately, but everything to do with the weather. Ice cores, tree rings, and written texts all provide scientists with evidence that over the span of some 400 years, the entire world got warmer. This was devastating in some places, like the Sahara in Africa and the southern portions of North America and parts of South America. But in medieval Europe and the far north of the Americas, heading toward the Arctic Circle, well, it was an incredible blessing. Suddenly, the growing season was longer, more temperate, and crops failed less often than they had previously. Suddenly, there is, generally speaking, not only enough food to go around, but also some left over. Those who were subsistence farmers were better nourished. Those for whom they worked, usually a lord on whose manor they lived, were wealthier in cash because they could trade the surplus for goods and money. Trade increased. If you have extra wheat, you don't want to sell it to your next-door neighbor. After all, they probably have plenty of wheat themselves. But you might find an eager buyer a few hundred or so miles away, in a place where it was difficult to farm wheat, but easier to produce, say, linen or beeswax or wine. So when people had more of whatever it is they had worked to produce, they started to look farther and farther away, because that was where you could get the best price for your product, where it was scarce, rather than where it was plentiful. Now, we should note that the little optimum did not mean that there was pleasant weather all the time over this long time span. There were certainly a fair number of hard winters, late springs, early frosts, and other challenging climatic effects. But on the whole, the weather was optimum most of the time for an agricultural society. The simple fact of the more plentiful regular harvests produced, as I suggested earlier, a cascade effect. Suddenly, with better nutrition, more children lived through the dangerous periods of infancy and childhood, surviving to become adults who, in turn, reproduced. And the cycle repeated. The population began to grow, and as it grew, what had been a pretty stable ratio of land to people began to shift, as there were more people who needed and wanted land to work. In the 12th century in Germany, this produced a clearly identifiably government-sanctioned program, the Drang nach Osten, or Push to the East, when overcrowding prompted German lords to encourage migration and settlement east into what is now Poland and Slavic lands. In other places, starting in the 11th century, we see first of all the claiming of all available land that was, to this point, uninhabited or unclaimed. Many pieces of land that were open but had previously been unavailable for farming, the soils were too dense or clayey, or the region was too wet and marshy to support farming. Well, suddenly this situation became the catalyst for creative solutions to agricultural problems. As we'll see in greater detail in our next lecture, this necessity, one of the major themes of this course, led to technological advances in the fields of agriculture, including the invention of the heavy plow, horse collar, and three-field rotation system. If you want to know more about these innovations, be sure to join us for Lecture 19. But to get back to the little optimum and the need/desire for land that it had created. Once all the available land had been claimed, the population turned its eyes to the forests, which, as I indicated earlier, occupied a significant portion of the medieval landscape. Through a process known as assarting, medieval peasants began to bring forest land under the plow. The way this process must have worked tells us something about the incredible interconnectedness of medieval communities and how desperate the need for land must have become. First, a community would need to identify which forest land they wished to convert to plowland. Then, in a joint effort, members of the community would go into the forest and climb the trees that were designated for cutting. First, they would cut all the branches off, a potentially dangerous task, as one could be struck by a falling branch from above, or one could fall oneself from a perch in the tree. Then, with the branches down, the tree itself would be felled. All that wood was either hauled away or, in most instances, burned where it fell, as medieval people recognized that this provided the soil with nutrients. After this, the stumps would have to be removed. Again, a laborious and back-breaking process. And all of this so that a peasant could spend more time engaged in the sun-up to sundown activity of plowing, sowing, tending, and harvesting. But while a sartine held many benefits for the population of the medieval world, the decline of the forests had negative impacts as well. While in many places forests were reserved as the site of hunting for the king and for the king only, the forest could provide many other resources to a community. Pigs were let loose to forage there, as they could consume many things other animals and people found inedible. People foraged there as well, for wild herbs and mushrooms and other similar foodstuffs. It was where the smith procured charcoal to fire his forge, and peasants were usually allowed to take dead wood from the forest for their own cooking fires. Incidentally, this is supposedly where the phrase by hook or by crook comes from, because very often the dead wood would be branches caught in the branches of other trees still living. Commoners were allowed to take a hooked wooden staff, also sometimes called a crook, and try to dislodge the dead wood so they could claim it for their own use. In fact, forest land had so many uses that in some places it was referred to as, quote, the mantle of the poor, end quote, meaning that it offered some protection, a buffer zone, for those at the very bottom of society who had very little in the way of resources. But with the increase in a sartine and decrease in the amount of forest land that was available for use in this way, we see the first real signs that this warming trend might not be all that great in the long run. For now, with less forest available, rulers tightened controls over it even more, and this created a larger class of truly destitute people. In the past, they might have managed to eke out an existence in their home communities as beggars. Because medieval society was largely stable, with not so many people moving about, beggars were often well-known members of a community. In other words, the people living in a particular hamlet knew the family of a beggar and what circumstances had brought him to this low position. And beggars were also regarded as serving an important function in that they supplied the opportunity for people to demonstrate Christian charity. Most beggars could also rely on help from the local parish church. With so many stories about corrupt clergy coming down to us from the medieval period, it is important to remember that the church was often the greatest force for good in the Middle Ages, especially in small communities where the lives of clergy and secular townspeople were deeply interwoven. But with the surplus food supply, there now existed another place beggars could go: the city. This was a place for great opportunity for many people, but it also had its negatives, as the very, very poor were now cut loose from the social networks in smaller hamlets, of which they had been an intrinsic part for so long. But the lure of the cities was hard for many to ignore, especially as there was an increase in urbanization during this period, as trade flourished. Trade in goods like wine, as warmer weather was producing some delicious wines from the area that we now think of as France. Trade in wine became a going concern. Like a boulder rolling downhill, the changes in the medieval world due to increased crop production began to build faster and faster, each one, it seemed, more dramatic than the last. Soon, cities were places of possibility for prosperity, where merchants could make money and rise to an economic status that had only been available to nobles before this. But if urban centers attracted those who were rising in society, it also attracted those who were at the bottom of the order. Medieval urban centers were full of beggars, people who had no place else to go, especially with the disappearance of the forests, and they turned to the cities in a last, desperate attempt to survive. Gambling, prostitution, thievery, medieval cities were rife with it. So, we have a growing population, a diminishing forest land, and a burgeoning urban scene. But there was more. The change in climate apparently led to a huge increase in sea fish populations, particularly herring and cod. In places where fishing yields had been moderate at best, suddenly there were large schools of fish, ready to be netted, packed in barrels of brine, and transported and sold throughout the medieval world. Now, what we have to remember is that the medieval diet was notoriously low in protein for the majority of the population. Most people survived on cereal grains converted into some kind of bread, along with dairy products. Fruit and vegetables were seasonal, but the type and variety you could get depended on what you could grow where you lived. You'll remember from Lecture 3 that on the Iberian Peninsula before the 8th century, the populations were almost always on the point of starvation because they were attempting to use farming methods from the north in a land that was ill-suited to them. Once the Muslims took over in 711 and introduced both foods more appropriate to the climate and an efficient irrigation system, Al-Andalus went from being a realm of scarcity to one of abundance. As we'll see in our next lecture, when there was a food surplus, people not only had a moment to catch their breath and look up at the world around them and think about the future more long-term, they also had the time and the inclination to wrest still more out of the earth, to try and figure out even better ways to get the land to produce. Then you add to this the sudden appearance of a plentiful source of protein, and the enterprise becomes even more enthusiastic. This period marks the first significant phase of sea fishing and trade. Encouraged by the success of netting large numbers of cod and herring, more and more people turned to the sea, and when they did this, they were motivated out of necessity to get better at sailing on water. As you might guess by now, this period heralded significant advances in shipbuilding and navigation, along with transportation and storage issues when it came to keeping the fish fresh for as long as possible. But not everyone out adventuring on the high seas at this time was looking for fish. Plenty were looking for land. With warmer temperatures, scientists have described how on occasion the sea would have experienced a phenomenon whereby the waters became very still and glassy. In other words, great for sailing across. Medieval seafarers now felt inclined to venture further than they had before. One of these was a man called Erik Thorvaldsson, whom most of us know today by the name of Erik the Red. Formerly exiled from Iceland for 3 years for having committed some quote-unquote killings, Erik and a group of followers traveled west at the end of the 10th century. They established the first European settlement in Greenland. While Icelanders had known of Greenland for some time, Erik was the first to settle it formally, and this may be because the little Optimum was coming into its full effect right around the time Erik landed on Greenland's shores. So for the first time, Greenland seemed to be a place that could be habitable by people who were using mainstream European farming and survival techniques. The colony flourished there for a while, but eventually was abandoned. And again, the cause seems to have been climate change. As the little Optimum drew to a close and temperatures fell, the growing season grew much shorter. But unlike the native population of Greenland, and these were Inuit peoples, culturally related to the populations in North America, sometimes referred to as Eskimos, unlike these people, the Icelanders did not adapt. They persisted in trying to make European living styles work in a non-European setting, and eventually, the colony collapsed and was abandoned. We see history repeating itself today with the onset of global warming. For the first time in living memory, people living in places like Greenland and Iceland are able to plant crops they never could have planted before because the growing season was previously so short. Now, with longer periods of warm days, certain foodstuffs formerly imported are able to be produced and sold locally. The little Optimum is also the time when we have the first regular contact between the European and North American worlds. Eric's son, Lever, or Leif Erikson, supposedly journeyed to North America sometime around the year 1000. He established a settlement in what is today Newfoundland, and for a time, regular trade and travel existed between North America and Iceland. Of particular interest were the grapes that Leif and his men brought back from a region that he named Vinland, after the fact that it was full of wild grapevines. The accounts of the Icelandic sagas are clear about this, and this is yet another indicator of how the climate must have changed at this time if there were grapes growing wild so far north. You'll also remember that, thanks to the medieval warm period, France's wine trade was booming. And in one of those fascinating interconnected aspects of history, this may be what in fact eventually produced the greatest writer in the English language during the medieval period. Geoffrey Chaucer came from a family of vintners who made their money importing and selling wine from the continent. The existence of this new trade, the fact that the Chaucers did it well and made money from it, and then the appearance of another of our turning points, which we'll discuss in Lecture 20, the Black Death, opened up possibilities for Geoffrey Chaucer that did not exist just 50 years or so before his lifetime. But in the run-up to the Black Death, which appeared in the medieval world around 1348, we have a repeating cycle of higher food yields, which led to better nutrition, which led to an increase in population, which led to the development of technologies designed to get even more food from the land and sea, and again, this led to an increase in population, which finally produced a situation in the 13th and 14th centuries in which the needs of the people outstripped the ability of the land to sustain that population. This resulted, as we've already seen, in those people that could, trying to maintain ever tighter control over the resources that were available to them. And this, in turn, may have produced the kind of mentality that led to the rise of the persecuting society we discussed in our last lecture. Although it may not have been intentionally thought out this way, by stripping certain groups on the margins of society, lepers, homosexuals, heretics, pagans, Jews, and others, of their rights and properties, there was now more in the way of resources for those who were in the mainstream of the medieval world. Now, while the little Optimum was producing generally improved living and crop production conditions for those in medieval Europe and those to the north and west of this area, in other parts of the world, it was having a disastrous effect. Portions of the American Southwest, for example, underwent such sustained drought conditions that native communities that had been established for hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years, were forced to relocate long distances in search of a reliable water source. And just to the east of the medieval world, on the Eurasian steppes, a group of nomadic peoples known as the Mongols were finding their ages-old way of life threatened by the changing climate. Unable to rely on the patterns of seasonal migration that had long sustained them, they turned their eyes toward the west. And in one of those historical moments in which we have the right person in the right place at the right time to effect a significant shift, this climate change and period of necessity and crisis was occurring at exactly the moment that a man named Genghis Khan came into power. Most of you have probably heard the name Genghis Khan, and while you may not know the details, you probably associate that name with horses, brutal warfare, and the image of the horde. Indeed, Genghis Khan's followers were known as the Golden Horde, and when they were forced to move out of their grassland home because of climate change, this horde moved en masse at the behest of the great Khan himself. First, he looked east and south. He demolished several cities in Asia, destroyed the famed irrigation systems of Iraq so that they were beyond repair, and thus helped usher in a new, more austere and severe brand of Islam among those who survived his depredations. Then he turned back to the west. Genghis and his descendants had fought ferocious battles on the Hungarian plain, and they had pushed those people, also known as the Magyars, further west themselves, as we saw in our lecture on the Battle of Lechfeld. Shortly before Genghis Khan died, he reportedly told his sons, quote, "With heaven's aid, I have conquered for you a huge empire. But my life is too short to achieve the conquest of the world. That task is left for you." End quote. Around the middle of the 13th century, his heirs continued to push west into modern-day Russia, Poland, and Hungary. But then, the climate began to change again. Rains returned to the steppes, and life in the ancestral homeland of the Mongols became easier. Anthropologist Brian Fagan contends that this is what saved Europe from further incursions from the Mongols. If the weather had not suddenly become more conducive to life on the steppes, he points out that the Mongols would have continued to push west. We even know what the plan of attack would have been. First, invade Austria and destroy Vienna. Next, go on to Germany and then south to Italy. Once those territories were secure, the plan was to continue west into France and Spain. As Fagan says, the possibilities of paths not taken here are fascinating for historians and scientists to consider. Quote, "Would Europe have become a Muslim continent? Or would the Mongols, who were tolerant of other beliefs, have left the Catholic Church alone? Had the conquest taken hold, would there have been incentives for European explorers and merchants to find new ways to tap the riches of Asia by opening new seaways across the Atlantic and round the Cape of Good Hope to India, when they could have land routes across a unified empire? Had the climatic pendulum not swung back, there would have been no incentive to return home to a drought-ridden, arid land." End quote. But the weather did indeed change, and it started to change at exactly the moment when history hung in the balance and Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, was deciding whether he would keep moving west or reestablish himself on the Eurasian steppes. He chose the latter, and the stream of history chose to flow into one riverbed rather than another. While this effect of the ending of the Little Optimum, or medieval warm period, was beneficial, certainly, to those living in the medieval world, other changes had a dramatically negative impact. In the years 1315 to 1322, records indicate that there was record rainfall every spring. For close to 6 weeks at a stretch, it rained and rained and rained. Seeds that had been planted at the beginning of sowing season were simply washed out of the ground by so much water. Those that weren't washed away moldered in the damp earth or refused to sprout because of the damp, soggy conditions. Harvests were painfully poor, especially for a population that was close to 80 million people. Whereas in the year 1200, advances in agriculture that resulted from the luxury afforded by the more temperate climate had caused a population boom, just over a century later, that huge population was an equally huge problem. The cycle had completed itself, and we were back to a situation like that in the year 1000, when most of the population was severely undernourished and thus more susceptible to disease and infection. When the Black Death raged through the medieval world starting in 1348, it encountered a population that had little in the way of natural defense against such a terrible foe, something we'll talk about at greater length in Lecture 21. But in our next lecture, we're going to turn back to the period of the Little Optimum and try to understand the agricultural innovations that came into existence during this time, when people were making the most of the reprieve from harsh conditions that the climate had suddenly given them. Next time, we'll talk about the innovations of the heavy plow, horse collar, and 3-field rotation systems, important developments that were made possible by the Little Optimum and which would continue to support the population boom the change in weather had made possible. This also increased population health and growth exponentially. Until, of course, once again, the population grew to a point where the ability of the land to sustain people was outstripped by the number of people relying on it. Next time, we'll see both the positive and negative impacts of agricultural innovation.